they'll like act and be who they truly are, but they don't want people to know like that's how they are to the public. So I think it's kind of funny of bringing out a way of like who someone truly is behind closed doors, I guess.
And we can ask, that's an ethical question that we'll talk about when we get to Kant especially, is it okay to take someone who is unethical in secret, in your opinion, and expose them by doing things that would otherwise be unethical yourself, right? If I, instead of asking for y'all's permission, just secretly recorded these classes, that might seem unethical, right? And does it make it ethical if I do so because I think that college kids aren't persons and so I don't care if you consent or not, right? That might seem morally problematic to say it's okay to use this means to my ends in that way. Good. Other thoughts on this? It's a good topic, right? The freedom of speech is a very substantial debate, the idea about defamation. So on the flip side, right, you have individuals like Donald Trump, for example, who want to strengthen libel laws, who want to make it easier to prosecute an individual for lying about other people in various ways. Yeah.
Yeah, so like the show, I completely agree with you in that I think that there's a point in which there should be a limit, definitely. But I think that he strategically chose the people that were going to be on the show, and I think that the show is, a lot of people that watch it are probably very liberal.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, I just think that the people on the show, and what he did on the show was just, hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
And that was,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But I think at times it was, very extreme, but I think,
And ethically, we want to be careful
yeah.
about letting things off the hook because we think they're hilarious.
Yeah.
I don't think what he did was that unethical, just because he was just saying outrageous things and people were agreeing with him. He wasn't tricking them into saying outrageous things.
Not entrapment, you don't think?
Yeah, he was just saying absurd things that we should train 3-year-olds to hold guns, and people were agreeing.
Yeah, people were agreeing with him. That's how he tried to make. He wasn't saying anything bad about other people. For the most part, it was most just getting people to agree with him because he's playing all these different characters,
Mm-hmm.
and he's just getting people to be like, "Oh yeah, great idea," showing their character.
Well, here's another ethical dilemma that goes along with this that plays into what we're discussing today. Is he doing something wrong in contributing to a very toxic environment? We live in a highly politicized, highly toxic environment right now, and his sort of brand of satirical exposure could arguably be turning up the temperature on that kind of conflict. What do y'all think about that? What would MLK say about that?
Yeah. It's fine if you share the same views as him, but if it's him making fun of you, you're going to get mad. So you can't say, you can't pick and choose what's free speech, I guess.
You don't think that Sacha Baron Cohen is changing hearts and minds with his new show?
No, it's making those people stronger in their beliefs, and then the people he's making fun of stronger in their beliefs because people are mocking them.
Right. So if you are someone who might be opposed to outrage culture, for example, isn't this show just a manufacturing outrage? And maybe you think manufacturing outrage is a good thing right now. Maybe you think we need more outrage. But yeah, I think that's a good, relevant debate, and it ties to what we're talking about today. Good. Any final thoughts on that? So this is great. This is what I have in mind with these kinds of warm-ups, right? We don't need to solve the problem of Sacha Baron Cohen in our first 5 minutes or 10 minutes, but we want to get thinking about these kinds of topics in ethical directions. What are the ethical kinds of questions that come up? How do we sort of try to balance those ethical needs? Okay, so, letter from a Birmingham jail. What are y'all's first impressions reading this? First of all, did anybody not know who MLK was going into this? I just like to check, right? Has anybody read anything from MLK before reading this? Or was this all your first time reading Letter from a Birmingham Jail? Or something by him? Maybe you've read pieces of the I Have a Dream speech or something like that. What did you think of his writing? You can have aesthetic preferences too. Yeah.
I was It was just so powerful.
Okay, so you find his voice particularly evocative,
Yes.
right? Not a very controversial view to have about MLK, but I think it's interesting to notice why certain people get reputations for being persuasive. Because part of what we're trying to learn here is to be ethically persuasive, and so you want to start looking for the tricks of the trade in these different papers. Yeah.
I think he's an excellent writer, like very skillful. His use of parallelism, like especially when he was talking about like extremism,
Mhm.
how he compared like extremism, like we're extremists of love, and like what type of extremist are you? That
Mhm.
was like especially powerful, I thought, and his use of those like those linguistic choices were very powerful.
Good. So you start to notice all these different rhetorical techniques that he is a well-known public speaker and preacher learned a lot of those. Good. Yeah.
I like how he was aware of his audience. Since he knew they were religious leaders, he was using biblical references that they could relate to.
Good, right? So there's a tricky balance that you often have to do when you're making ethical arguments of playing to your audience while also playing to a sort of broader universal audience, because appeals to God aren't going to do much to an atheist, but they might be much more effective than appeals to secular ethics to a religious person. And there's not, I think, in my opinion, nothing unethical about tailoring your argument to your audience as long as you're not doing it to trick them. As long as you do it in a sincere, honest, trying to help them understand kind of way. Good. Any other particular passages that jumped out at you? Yeah.
The passage when he was talking about the things that the black community were going through, talking about like telling your little daughter that she can't go to this theme park because they don't allow colored children in, and he went on and on about just the frustrations that they go through on a daily basis. And it really just got to me as a black person, but also I feel like it will have gotten to his audience as well,
Mm-hmm.
because he really explicitly showed the frustrations that this community was going through, and it was very powerful and emotional. And that one passage I really got.
Good. So, in philosophy, we get nervous sometimes about what we would call appeals to emotion. That this is a logical fallacy in some contexts. If you ask me an empirical question, or whether some empirical claim is true, right? And I respond, by empirical I mean fact-based. How big is the Earth or something? And I respond, well, okay, the Earth is only 6,000 years old. Doesn't that feel true? I don't have any evidence for it, but doesn't it feel like the right thing? That's a fallacious kind of argument. It's not a good kind of argument just to ask you to go on your gut feeling. In ethics, it's a little more complicated because we often want to use people's empathy as part of their ability to understand ethical considerations. And depending on your ethical views, you might not think there's anything wrong with empathy as a source of ethical insight. So you have to be careful. You don't want to play on emotions in inappropriate kinds of ways within an ethical argument, using things like, so it's tricky, right? So there's like a famous example of the think of the children as like a common refrain you hear in moralizing arguments, right? We can't have pornography because think of the children. You can't have gay marriage because think of the children. He's making an argument like that, right? Think of the children. And the question is, why is it okay in some contexts and not in others? These are very tricky sort of ethical issues. But I do think it does seem like there are situations where it is okay to say, look at this situation. How does it make you feel? How would it make you feel if you were in that situation? And that can be a form of legitimate ethical argument, partly because it's an appeal to consistency a lot of the time. It's usually a form of, if you were in this situation, you'd be very unhappy. So, why aren't you unhappy that other people are in this situation? Good. There's a lot of stuff in this one. It's great. Any other thing before we dive in some more? Yeah.
I like the passage where he mentioned that the letter might be particularly long, and he said how like he had a lot of free time, and he also thought a lot of like strange thoughts. So him being able to write this letter while he's in jail just shows how like strong he really is,
Mm-hmm.
and like carrying the burden of the outside world while he's detained.
Yeah, and you know, again, as philosophers, we have to be careful not to get sucked in by narrative. But you can see the mythic resonance of him writing this in jail, alluding to specifically Socrates and the Credo, which takes place while Socrates is in jail for, you know, similar kinds of disruptive behavior. So yeah, it does feel like locating it in that place and time matters. It has an impact on the story. Good. So, right, one of the reasons I start with this, rather than just diving straight into our normative philosophy, which we're going to start with next time, is that I think it's a perfect example of this reoccurring theme that ethics really only matters when it's applied on the ground. That doesn't mean that metaethics isn't important. It means that it should eventually come back around to helping people. Our ethical concerns start with trying to solve these everyday problems that we face as conscious entities in an imperfect world. And then we move up into levels of complexity, trying to understand our situation and what we ought to do. And then we have to bring that back down to see, well, how does that work out for real people in the world? Because oftentimes, all of the ethical things that we unpack when we are working through these different theories come into play often in conflict within these discussions. So you see within this paper, MLK actively wrestling with tensions between competing moral needs. What sorts of competing moral needs do we see at play in this paper? What is he struggling with here? It's tricky. Yeah.
In a way, he's kind of struggling with the ideals of doing what's right and what's wrong. To him, it's pretty clear that unjust laws have to be broken, and just laws have to be followed. But he's struggling with other people thinking the opposite and thinking that every law should be followed. And he's kind of making his point and making that apparent to other people.
Good, right? So the first primary tension we see throughout this paper is this conflict between morality and laws. Now that, for some people, might seem like it's in itself kind of a confusing contrast because, right, some of you, last class we discovered, believe that morality is maybe nothing more than what a society decides is moral. If you don't think that morality is real, and this is jumping a little bit ahead, if you don't think that there's anything real about one moral claim versus another, you may believe that what is good is just following the laws. But we can show, I think pretty effectively, that there is such a thing as an unjust law and that it seems problematic to follow unjust laws, and therefore we have this competing tension between our desire to do the right thing and our desire to be law-abiding citizens. And we have to figure out how to balance that tension. Good. Anybody notice any other key tensions in this paper? Yeah.
Would keeping up with the status quo versus change be one of them?
So change versus the status quo, right? And he's pretty clearly on about change here, but that's certainly a conflict, yep.
Extremism versus complacency.
Good, extremism versus some form of complacency. That would be another main one we'd want to look at here, and that goes along with sort of a practical concern about change, right? The idea of sort of direct action versus passivity, what amount of engagement you have a moral obligation towards, given the view that you are living in an unjust society. And then incremental change versus radical change is a reoccurring question here. And that's one that's still very salient, I think, for a lot of people today. What is the right thing to do when faced with injustice? Is it slow, small step incremental change, or is it radical upheaval of the current system and replacing it with a new system? Does anybody here know at least one person who would love to just see the whole system burn to the ground and start over? Yeah. Right? Anyone here more sympathetic to the view that incremental change is the best way to actually achieve social progress? I haven't really thought about this in particular yet, right? So these are the sorts of ethical things we want to be thinking about. What is the right way? And even if we all agree change is needed, we still have a further moral question. What is the right way to engage in change? We also get a contrast here that's going to come up again throughout this class. That's why I love this paper. So many things that are going to reoccur for us. The contrast between descriptive and prescriptive morality. Does anybody know what I mean by descriptive versus prescriptive morality? So think of the passage where he talks about the church and what the church's job is supposed to be. He says it's not supposed to be a thermostat for what human beings believe that just measures what descriptively is true about your ethical beliefs, but it should be a leader in what you ought to believe. That's the difference between prescription and description, the difference between what you do believe and how you do act with regard to ethics, and how you ought to act with regard to ethics. And that is an important difference. We're going to look at some arguments that say, I'm only making descriptive claims about what human beings do or don't do with regard to ethics, and others that are going to say, I know that descriptively you act this way, I'm saying you ought to act this other way. We also get some discussion here about tribalism versus universalism. This is another one that I think is very salient today with Sacha Baron Cohen increasing our tribalism every day, right? And here we mean tribalism not in the ancient tribes, but in the sense of having a mindset of an in-group and an out-group, that you're part of a group that has certain cultural identity associated with it, and that group has specific needs that have to be spoken to or specific conversations that they are having internally that are separate from their engagement with the universal world. And in an ethical debate, like we were talking about with appeals to God, some ethical arguments are appeals within the tribe, whereas on other ethical arguments are attempts to speak to everyone. And there's some debate about which of those is the better way to persuade as well, right? So who's familiar with debates in modern culture about identity politics? You ever heard that phrase before? Right, what is identity politics?
Basically, the ability to identify each individual.
A little bit. Want to help in? So the people who use this term most are usually the opponents of identity politics. It's usually used as a derogatory term to mean appealing to identities within groups rather than individuals or universal preferences. So if I think that the best way to succeed politically is to speak to this group and their particular problems and this group and their particular problems versus trying to make a case for everyone about, say, economic improvement being good for all people. Does that make sense? And he struggles with sort of what the right balance is between those things. And then, of course, there was the extremist versus the moderate concern. We're going to see that he knows and is very keenly aware that his position on the moderate spectrum towards extremism has a large impact on how he is perceived, how other individuals who are trying to enact social change are perceived. He's very concerned about the idea that his particular approach could be used as a cudgel against more extreme individuals, and at the same time, he's aware that he is himself called an extremist, and he has to wrestle with that. So, in order to do all of this, he sort of starts by framing all of this in the form of addressing objections, which is a good technique. We often will see the consideration of objections within the different papers that we're looking at, not necessarily the entirety of the paper being sort of driven by, I'm going to address some concerns people have raised about me, but like you'll see when you're writing your paper, including objections to your review is essential to doing a good job here. So what is the outsider objection that he starts with? What is this objection people are raising against his activities? Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's going to be our next objection. So put a pin in that for a second. Yeah.
He's not from Birmingham. He came from another place and trying to change the way of life, basically.
Right. So it's this idea that he's an outsider and he's coming in and he's stirring up trouble, and there's something morally wrong about that. So I know it's hard to be opposed to MLK. I know it's hard to say negative things, but it's a good practice to think, what is right about that argument when I'm not applying it to MLK? Is there a sense in which it is unethical to go in and mess around in a group of individuals, potentially? See some nodding. Why? Okay. But, white colonialist intentions were often good. The missionary intentions were good. Yeah.
Can you get to the issue of the hero complex, or when someone enters a community without taking the community's interests at heart?
Good, right? So if you roll up into a community without knowing the realities of their situation and start dictating to them what they ethically ought to do, you could potentially cause a lot of harm, right? If I go into a community that can't afford to become vegetarians and tell them ethically, you're monsters if you don't become vegetarians, and take away their animals, right? That might seem to me like the ethical thing to do, but I might be causing a lot of harm in the act of doing so. So we have to be careful when we get involved that we aren't doing more harm than good. Yeah.
I was just gonna say, he brings up the argument of how everyone is like interconnected somehow. So I feel like
Right.
that backs up his approach.
Right, so this is his pushback, right? So now that we've considered what might be reasonable in the objection to him, we can see how he pushes back on that objection, and he does so in a couple of ways, right? He says, first of all, I'm part of this community. I was asked to come into this community by members of the community, and that in a sense makes me part of it. But more importantly, when we define the community, we should really be defining it much more broadly than just the limits of Birmingham. We are talking about the ethical community, and in that sense, we are all part of this same community. Yeah.
So his response, I thought, was, logical when people said, you're coming in and trying to change things way too fast, you're being too rash. He said, well, it's easy for you to,
Hang on. We're going to get there.
Oh, okay.
I just want to finish this one up first, and then we're going to get to the wait objection. No, it's good. It's good. I know. It's exciting. Right? We're all having fun here. But there's a really great quote in this particular section that I want to make sure that we notice before we move on. What does he say? This is one of his most eloquent lines for a lot of people that backs up this idea that we always have an obligation to get involved. Yeah. What is it? Go ahead.
Is it the one where he said injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere?
Yeah, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That's a highly quotable ethical principle, if ever I heard one. Do we all agree? What is he claiming? Why does this seem to be true?
So, is it the kind of thing where it's like, what was I gonna say? Oh, like you can't pick and choose, like to follow the law, you can't pick and choose when something's just and when something's unjust, like when it's convenient for you. You know what I mean? Like
Sure.
you can say that it's against the law to that it was not against the law to kill people in the Holocaust. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and the question is,
So that's injustice, but it's still a threat because you can't pick and choose.
why can't we pick and choose though? Yeah.
I feel like if there's like some form of injustice somewhere, then justice wasn't fully accomplished.
Okay, but if I'm living in a just place, why should I care? Right? Do you all actively concern yourselves with the injustices happening on the other side of the world? It's hard. Hard to take all that in. We're not really hardwired for it. Yeah.
But I think so more he's saying that it's a threat. So it's a threat meaning that it can become there. So even though it's not there right now, it's a threat that one day it can be where you are.
Good. I just wanted to make these sort of implicit intuitions explicit by saying the concern is that injustice could spread, that allowing people to pick and choose inevitably leads to them choosing in ways that you're not going to be happy with. So from a purely pragmatic perspective, anyone who wants to be treated justly, right, this is kind of golden rule idea, should be out there making sure others are being treated justly so that they can reasonably demand that they also be treated that way. Good. So now we get this other objection, right? Wait, slow down, right? This idea that, like I was saying, some people believe, okay, I agree, social change is valuable. We all want social change, but it has to happen at the right speed. It can't happen too quickly. What is the argument, again, ignoring that it is against MLK, what is the argument for incremental change versus radical change? Why would people think that slower is better?
They believe it's much more peaceful because it's not causing some form of social unrest.
Okay, so you get less unrest, less pushback, potentially? What other concerns might there be? Yeah.
It just allows people to kind of learn to get used to it.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it will help with the unrest, it'll just allow people to, like take it slow. It's something that's not an issue to me yet because it hasn't become brought up like that. But it slowly just becomes to the acceptance point if you're willing to.
Right, so getting people to ease into it. What are the other advantages, though, of incremental change? Yeah.
Like micro tuning is kind of like you see it'll work in that sense and you can move on. If not, then you just make adjustments.
Good, so if your concern is that the radical change goes too far, too quickly, and you're not having enough safeguards for making sure that it doesn't actually lead to more harm, then that could be potentially more dangerous, right? If we overthrow the government and replace it with radical communism, it might accidentally lead to a lot more harm than if we slowly shift the government and see how things go as we're shifting it. So that could be another one. There's one more consideration here that I want to make sure we're all aware of, right? It's the idea that while you might get more upside to radical change, it is less likely to be achievable. You're less likely to be able, not just because of the pushback, but just because there's a lot invested in the current system, you're less likely to be able to create those really big changes, whereas small steps that can be successfully made and move the ball down the field might actually produce better results over time. So that would be the argument that he is sort of confronted with here, the strongest version of this wait, take your time argument, right? And this is where we see one of these kinds of appeal to emotion pushbacks that I was talking about at the beginning. I think this is a really strong line. When you have seen vicious mobs lynch your mothers and fathers at will and drown your sisters and brothers at whim, then you will understand why we find it difficult to wait. Now notice, that doesn't disprove any of those considerations I just brought up in the sense that it might still not be a more successful model. What he's saying here is it's morally problematic to demand that people in oppressed positions take up that incremental model because you are effectively asking them to continue to suffer. Right, so again, this highlights how empathy can often play a key role here. He also points out, this is in pushback to the idea that he's the troublemaker, that he's the one raising tensions. Right? He says, actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. Right? So this is pushing back on what we today would call victim blaming. You all heard that term? Right? Where someone, in this case, is claiming that the members of the oppressed group are to blame for the tension that is occurring, when in reality it seems like the tension is there because of the people who are actively oppressing them. And so he's pushing back on something we often see, which is the shifting of the burden of responsibility ethically to the oppressed group. The idea that it is their job to placate the emotional state of the oppressor so as to diffuse the tension in the situation, so as to then be able to politely ask for their freedom or their rights or equality or whatever is owed to them. And that in turn is putting more and more of the psychological, of the organizational burden on the individuals who are already suffering from the situation. So, even if it might be practically true that that incremental change might be the best way to get things done, it comes with a moral cost, he would say, and we shouldn't be blind to that moral cost. Good. Okay, so at this point, right, we get an account of the way that we should engage in direct action, right? So his theory isn't just going to be, let's go out and break a bunch of laws. That's not how this is going to work. We have a very specific set of principles that we need to go through. And I asked y'all on your quiz, right, what are those methods, or specifically which one is it among those methods? So what's needed to engage in proper ethical direct action? What are our steps? Mm-hmm. First step.
Isn't it the gathering of information or facts?
Good, right? So first, we got to make sure we know what we're talking about. That's that whole don't go into a neighborhood and cause some trouble until you know what's going on, right? You have to make sure that there is some sort of injustice that is happening, and you have to make sure that all of the other venues for addressing that have been exhausted. That's our second step, in a sense. What's the second thing he says that should happen? Mm-hmm. Negotiations, right? So if you believe that there is a problem that has to be addressed, you first must address it via negotiations, exhausting every other option. Now, this is one point at which the radical individuals would probably push back on MLK's methods, because this is very incrementalist in its method. It's saying you have to take all the right steps first, even though in many of these contexts you know for a fact the individuals you are engaging with are not going to engage in good faith. Right? You still have to engage in good faith, because a lot of direct action is about being better than the person. Right? I know I just said it's frustrating that so much obligation gets put on the people who actually are having to fight for their own rights, right? But his view is, as frustrating as that is, to do this successfully, to do this method successfully, you really do have to go to extreme lengths to try every other option before you turn towards the violating of what you consider unjust laws. Okay, good. What's our next step? Self-purification. What does that mean? Does it mean we all go on a juice cleanse? Mm-hmm.
That's where he was talking about the workshops, about being docile, I guess, and taking the hurt but not giving it back.
Yes, you can understand how folks like Malcolm X would love these ideas,
Yeah.
right? But like, what his view was, in order to do what he's asking you to do, you have to put yourself in the right frame of mind, which is specifically the frame of mind to take a beating without fighting back. Because if you fight back, it undermines the whole enterprise, right? What does he say about individuals who can't self-purify in this way? What should they do? This is important. What are their options? Let's say that I want to engage in some protest with MLK, but when it comes time and he asks, can you do this without taking a beating, or take a beating without giving one back, and I say I don't think I'm the kind of person who can actually do it, what's he going to do? He's going to politely ask me not to engage in this protest, right? And he doesn't mean it as a judgment, I don't think, when he says some individuals aren't cut out for this, and you're not going to be able to do this, because what is being asked of you is a what we would call a supererogatory action in a sense. It's asking you to go above and beyond what we might think is ethically demanded of you. It's asking you to be the better person. And I think he would say it's no fault of an individual who doesn't genuinely believe that they can suffer that, right? And that those individuals should find other ways to engage with the situation if they want to be helpful, but they shouldn't try to put themselves in these situations knowing that they might be the one to fight back. So I just think that's a very interesting part. He's very serious about sticking by this method or it doesn't work. Okay, and then what's our last step? Right, our actual direct action. And technically not our last step, right? So the next thing is the direct action. Get out there and break some laws properly in the right way, as one ought to do, right? But that's not the end. That's just the means to an end. What's the next step? What do we do after the direct action? Yep. Okay, so if you accept the punishment of our actions, that was sort of something that we heard him talk about at length in the video last time, that part of what distinguishes him from the KKK who's riding around at night lynching people with masks on is that he's willing to take responsibility for his actions. What happens after that? Is it violent overthrow of the government? No. So what is it? Back to negotiations. Because in a sense, he is sort of a moderate reformer on this. When it comes to means, he takes a moderate approach. The purpose of direct action is to bring to a head the situation such that the negotiations have to be successful. That the people who before were not negotiating in good faith now feel compelled to do so enough that the resolution is successful or functional or agreed upon by everyone involved. So again, the goal is to come back to that thing that we couldn't do before. And he has this other great quotable line, and I'm curious what you think. Freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Can anybody think of any counterexamples? While you were reading, could you think of an example of a situation where freedom was given voluntarily rather than demanded by the oppressors? I don't know for a fact, empirically, that no such example exists. I'm not a historian enough to know that there might be some case out there where some benevolent leader came to power from a majority position and brought about a variety of reforms because they personally thought it was necessary and not because there was any kind of reformist movement in play at the time. I don't think that would necessarily undermine his general point here, though, that consistently those who feel that they are being oppressed usually have to speak up at great length before that oppression gets addressed. That humans by nature, like any other organism, likes to maintain supremacy because it provides power and security and luxury. And it's hard to give up those things when the status quo becomes threatened. But of course, we still have this concern. Yeah, I'm going to have to fix that for next time. If we can just reject whatever part of the law we think is unjust, how does society survive? Which is really a question of, can we make a functional distinction between a just and an unjust law? A lot of that is going to hinge on this. So what does he say? What is an unjust law? He gives a couple of swings at the definition for an unjust law. This is classic philosophizing here. We got to try to define our key moral distinction here, or else a lot of this isn't going to go anywhere. So what's his first attempt at an account of an unjust law? This is why it's good to bring your book.
I don't know if this was the first one, but one of them was a code that was out of harmony with moral law.
Good, right? So this first one is a code that's out of harmony with moral law, or he says, with the law of God. Now, how helpful is that for you, reading that, trying to figure out whether a law is just or unjust? Do you feel like you can distinguish, you can sort your laws based on that claim? Why? Why or why not? Yeah.
Well, he has like a very Christian approach to it, so it's only applicable to the Christian population. But if you try to apply this somewhere else, other religions tell you otherwise. So it's not as
Right. Right, so we get that problem of the narrow appeal argument that we were talking about before, where what we mean by the law of God may not be clear at all to those of us who aren't Christians, or it may be different if those of us who are a different sect or a different faith. So basing it purely on, quote-unquote, the law of God could be very problematic. Now, I think we can give a generous read here and imagine that he means a proper ethical interpretation of God's law, but that doesn't really help us sort of unpack the thing further. So we need another attempt here. So what else could we say? Yep.
Analysis looked at content and consequence, so it's whether it versus human relationships or race to personality.
Good. Right. So we get a couple of kind of consequences. So any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. What do we mean by human personality here? It's a kind of weird phrase. I want to take a stab at... Let's get some of these other voices. They're all sort of taking advantage of our folks who are speaking heavily here. Do you have any attempt on what he's getting at here?
Like personality, does he mean like
Something tied to that going on here. Yeah.
Maybe means like person's ability to do good in the world.
To do good, potentially. Yeah.
maybe he means like a person's dignity?
Person's dignity. Huh?
I think it's like a reference to personhood in general. So if you like anyway degrade their existence as a person,
Yeah, I think you're all sort of circling around the right idea here. I think what I think he has in mind is if you imagine a situation that deprives people of freedom, so that was a key part of this, you're imagining a situation where they're not allowed to express their own personal identity, where they are forced to be slaves or something, and that limits or restricts their ability to express themselves fully. Another term that we'll see when we get to virtue theory that I think could be supplemented in here is the idea of human flourishing. Anybody ever heard the term flourishing before? What do I mean by flourishing? It's an archaic kind of concept. Uh-huh.
From Aristotle, reaching your fullest potential.
Yeah, your fullest potential, whatever we mean by that, whether it's the telos that God gave you, or the telos, which means your purpose that you picked for yourself, whatever it means to be the best you, the most flourishing, happy, productive you that you can be. And I think what he is saying is that any law that restricts your ability to go out and flourish is an unjust law. So that's a little bit more helpful. We can think of certain things that would qualify as unjust on that view. Things like slavery, it seems, would certainly impede personal freedom, right? And we get this further account, I think, where we get the most sort of philosophically termed account, which I think further unpacks why these kinds of laws would have this detrimental impact on everyone involved. He says, it gives the segregator a false sense of superiority, and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. To use the words of Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, segregation substitutes an I-it relationship for the I-thou relationship, and ends up relegating persons to the status of things. So there's some kind of philosophical language for you there. What does that stuff mean about the I-it relationship versus the I-thou relationship? Right, that this dehumanizes other people. You ever heard the term objectifying someone? What does it mean to objectify someone? Yeah.
To reduce to that of an object.
So that I don't know, when is this most commonly used in our modern conversations? Yeah. Yeah, it's very commonly raised by feminists talking about objectifying women, treating women as typically sexual objects rather than full-fledged persons. And so what that does is it takes the relationship that I ought to have with all of you, for example, as conscious feeling entities, where I respect your ends and you respect mine. This is what we would call very Kantian kind of language. When we get to deontology, you're going to see a lot more of this. And replaces it with a kind of relationship that I have with this chair, where it would be totally okay for me to throw this chair across the room or light it on fires. You know, that people will be upset. But, like, no one's going to defend the chair except for its owner. Whereas, if I did that to y'all, I would get in a lot of trouble. And rightly so, because I'm not treating you as the person that you actually are. This goes further in the idea of what is bad about things like racism, that we often assume, not just racism, but really any ethical or any unethical activity. All unethical activities, we often think of they're bad because of who they harm, separate from the person doing the action. But in many situations, there is a harm done to the individual who engages in the unethical behavior. By continuously objectifying even one group of people, you might get in the habit of objectifying everyone. In a sense, you are making yourself less human. You are dehumanizing and brutalizing yourself by dehumanizing and brutalizing other people. So I think he wants to point out that the impact here is not just on the people who are being oppressed, but on the oppressors. It makes us all worse people. And he also points out that laws can be unjust even if they are written in neutral language. This is something that we have now confirmed within our legal system, but again, that doesn't necessarily prove that it's true. What are some examples of a law that is written in a neutral way? Can anybody think of any, but are still unethical? What's the very famous historic example? Or do you know one? Gun laws? Maybe in their application, they might be concerned that they aren't applied equally, potentially. Yeah.
Well, voting laws around that time where people were allowed to vote, anybody was allowed to vote, but they had like literacy tests, they had like other obstacles that didn't allow certain people to vote.
Great. So Jim Crow laws that are written clearly to exclude one group, but do not ever actually mention that group. What's the broad term for these kinds of laws during that period? You remember your history class? Right. Separate but equal. We have these claims, right, Plessy v. Ferguson, right, that we can have a separate but equal society. And what we've eventually decided is that that's not actually possible, it seems like. Separate always inevitably means unequal. There are a couple of specific court cases that really drive this home. There's a very famous one involving animal sacrificing, right? Sacrificing of chickens. There was a law that banned the sacrificing of chickens. Why would that be an unjust law? Mm-hmm.
Is it you are imposing on someone's spirituality?
Because
Religious right, because that's part of the spiritual practice, is sacrificing that.
good. And in this context, and this is something that they had to prove to overthrow the case, or to win the case, right, and overthrow the law, it was very clearly directed at voodoo practitioners, who, as you might imagine, are predominantly people of color. That's where voodoo comes from. And it was very explicitly built in such a way as to limit their freedom of religious expression. And they had to show that they were the people, even though it was written in a neutral way, it doesn't ever mention voodoo specifically, it had to effectively be proven that this is clearly an attempt to single out one group with an unjust law. Good. Okay, so before I run out of time here, I want to bring some other points up. This is an interesting passage. Maybe you all have seen this go around the internet a little bit more recently. It's getting a little more play than it used to, right? This is one of those passages that makes for a little pushback on the idea that MLK was as sort of mild and moderate as he's often made out to be in hindsight. So I'm just going to read this for you, and then I'm curious about your emotional responses to it, to be honest, right? So first, I must confess that over the last few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is the stride towards freedom is not the White Citizens Council or the Ku Klux Klanners, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who can agree who can constantly say, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I can't agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically feels that he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by the myth of time, and who constantly advised the Negro to wait until a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is more bewildering than outright rejection. What do y'all think about that? Do any of y'all feel attacked by this? If I were to point out that the reason this still gets attention today is because people would argue that this is just as true, if not more true today, than it was then. Clearly, he's trying to make you uncomfortable. I hope you're aware of that, right? You white moderates in the room, right? And that's another sort of example of our ethical arguments. This is what's tricky about being an ethicist. It's why everybody hates ethicists. It's because part of our job is to make you uncomfortable. Part of our job is to point out that you are doing something that seems insufficient, immoral, and that you need to do better. And sometimes that has to be done in the form of these kind of short, sharp shocks to your conscience. And you might take it as an extreme claim to say, oh, well, I'm just as bad as the person who actively goes around lynching people, right? And you might want to push back or something and say, well, I'm not really that bad. But it's an interesting technique and an interesting thing to consider how much this kind of constant drumbeat of slow down with your attempts at social progress is, in essence, one of the main things that prevents more effective social progress. Yeah, go ahead.
So that, like, I can think of something that happened to me that relates to this with the lukewarm acceptance. I'm a cashier somewhere, well, at Wawa, and one time there was a customer that was struggling with his English. Like, we get a lot of Hispanic customers, and he was struggling with his English, and I finally got him to understand that he needs to see his ID to get cigarettes. And he was like, oh, I don't have it, but it took a long time because he didn't really speak great English, and he just ended up leaving. I couldn't sell them to him. And so the person behind him was like so annoyed that the transaction took so long. She was white.
Mm-hmm.
And she was like, and I was like, oh, I feel so bad that I never learned more Spanish in high school. I was so bad at it. And she was like, well, maybe you should just learn more English. And I was like, Jesus, lady, seriously? Like, she's not going around being like, get out of the same store that I'm at, but she obviously was so angry, like, inside.
Yeah.
And like, accepting him, but like, not really accepting him.
Good. I want to be careful here, right? Because part of the class that we said from the beginning is we have to be respectful of differing ethical perspectives, right? There may be individuals in this class who might agree on some level that it's a person's obligation to learn the language of the country that they are moving to. So I just want to push back a little bit and say, you know, we don't want to portray someone like that who's frustrated as necessarily a villain, right? We should, even if we disagree with them, be able to put their argument in perspective, or at least be able to state their argument without having to be necessarily derogatory towards that. But right, so that could be sort of one kind of situation where you have this mindset of a moderate, not oppressed individual, where again we see that sort of burden shifting towards the other individual, that they need to go the extra mile to accommodate me and not vice versa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could go the other way too, I guess, but that's your job, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Good. Other thoughts about this? Yeah.
I know, like right now it's the Me Too movement. Like before, it's all like basically harassment has gotten to better. But back in the day, like let's say I'm a female and I went to my boss and say this person is harassing me, and this is a male, and because I am a woman of color, they're going to believe him more than I, and basically just like dismiss my case.
Okay. So there might be concerns like that now with, you could switch the words out here for men and women instead of races, and you might get similar kinds of things. I don't know how many of the men in this room have had active conversations about Me Too, but you may have had an experience at some point where one of your female friends tried to make you aware that they felt you were engaging in a kind of problematic moderateness, maybe in your defending of some particular individual or pushing back on some particular argument. And it's tricky. We don't want to use this stuff as a silencing tool, right? The goal is not to silence the people who might have those differing positions. The goal is to try to engage with them. But there comes a point sometimes in ethical debate where you have to say, I think what you're doing is wrong, and I can't soften that blow any further. And you're going to have to just sort of hear that a little bit. Good. Right, so we also bring up the myth of time, right? This was one of your quiz questions, right? Hopefully you got this right. So the myth of time is this idea that just because things move forward in time, things will necessarily get better. It's this strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. Do any of y'all have that intuition? I think this is something that you're raised with, to be honest, that progress is linear or inevitable in some kind of way? A little bit? You're raised in sort of this Western liberal democratic society that I think habituates you to think that there's this one direction that societies go in, from more oppressive monarchies or despots or whatever, up to the representational democracy, at which point society stops changing and we've hit our peak, and then just the quality of life just gets better and better from there on out, basically, right? But in reality, it doesn't necessarily work that way. You get backsliding, right? Progress is not either linear or necessarily universal. You might get progress in one part of society and backsliding in another part of society. Or you just don't get any progress at all, right? So what he wants to say is we can't just sit back and assume, right, that progress is going to happen. There's another famous MLK quote, right? The arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. And I think some people mistakenly understand that to mean it's going to bend that way whether we bend it or not. Right? Somehow humans will just get there. And I can understand why you might think that, right? If you think that human beings want to improve their quality of life, they are inevitably going to move towards a society that improves their quality of life. And that might be true to some extent, right? But I think we want to be skeptical that this actually occurs or occurs effectively without people really pushing hard on it. There's a lot of folks out there like Steven Pinker who will argue that we're living in the best possible time. And that may be true in some statistical ways, but it can be problematic if we take that to mean and this progress is inevitable or won't go away potentially, or I'm not saying that Pinker necessarily does that, but some people who follow Pinker will kind of take his stuff as a way to say, we don't need to worry about social progress anymore because we've achieved it. Right, good. So this other concern that we see here, right, this radical versus non-radical, complacency versus someone like Malcolm X, and the fear that because MLK's version of direct action involves nonviolence, that he will be used as a cudgel against other individuals who believe in different methods of achieving social progress, like the Black Panthers, for example. Right? And we can have a whole separate debate about what the Black Panthers actually did, how militant they actually were. But you can see the concern. We see it today. I see people say, MLK is amazing, but that Malcolm X caused so many problems. And it's an attempt to sort of create a wedge between these different social justice movements. You see it with feminism and the far left feminists or something, right? These same kind of maneuvers get made. And so if you're a moderate ethicist, you might not like, even if you really strongly believe in nonviolence, you might not like that you are being held up as a tool against other people who you think are trying to do the right thing, if not through the best ways. And then we also see that sometimes he bites the bullet on being called an extremist, because ethicists are often extremists, right? This sort of goes into the paradox of tolerance, which is the idea that we have to be tolerant of all ideas, or that moderation itself can become a fetish or a vice. The idea that if there are two strongly held opinions, the answer must be some sort of compromise between them. It's not possible that one of them is just wrong. These are the kinds of mindsets I think that he's worried about, that still we see in society today in some people, and that he thinks need to be challenged. And that's why he says, is it not right to be extreme sometimes? And what are the examples of extremists that he cites historically? The same ones he references in the video that we looked at last time. Sort of. Jesus. Right? Depends on what you believe, but yes. Right? So Jesus or Socrates again. Right? These people were considered extremists. They died for their extreme beliefs. And he's clearly willing to do the same. He says, will we be extremists for hate, or will we be extremists for love? As you're going to see when we look at utilitarianism, especially applied utilitarianism in the form of Peter Singer, sometimes people just argue for extreme positions, and they say, yes, I know this is an extreme position. I am demanding way more of you than you would like me to demand of you. Too bad. That's what ethics demands. That's the reality of our situation. And so you have to accept that. Okay. So we've got 10 minutes left. I want to spend 2 minutes, 2 to 3 minutes, fairly short. You're going to pair up with somebody, and I want you to consider these questions. Do you think that we live in an unjust or just society? Can you come up with an example of an unjust law that still exists today? And what would you do, what would you consider engaging in terms of direct action to overturn that unjust law? Okay, everybody get the questions? So short, quick, come up with an answer. What would you do? Why do you think it's unjust? Etc. And then we'll come back and share. Okay? Go ahead. Go forth. Or if you think we live in a utopia, say so. All right, one more minute. Okay, finish up your thoughts. Come on back. So, do we live in a utopia? No. Hey, one of you might have thought that we live in a 100% just society. I'm not going to rule out the possibility. But, what do we got? What are our unjust laws? Yeah?
The difference in prison time for crack and cocaine, knowing that crack and cocaine is usually done by different, like usually crack is done for most like colored people doing it, and so the time difference is way larger than cocaine, and then you see that as kind of like a usual law.
Okay, so different sentencing laws related to drugs that are used by different groups.
Yeah.
So they have,
Yeah.
I believe, during the Obama administration, they corrected some of those disparities. I don't want to say they fixed the thing entirely, but there was a little bit of movement on that particular subject. But yeah, drug laws in general might be a field of concern. Mm-hmm.
So we spoke about how in America abortion is technically legal, but in some states there's a lot of zoning laws and restrictions where they attempt to shut down clinics. Like for example, in Alabama, there's only one clinic that's open for abortion.
Okay.
It's not accessible to everybody.
Okay, so laws that effectively prohibit abortion might be unjust because they target women. So the second part of this that I wanted you all to consider, what would you do personally to fix the fact that you are living in that under that unjust law? Yeah, I want to get some more from people who haven't talked yet at all in class. These are some questions you can answer.
So I thought of like healthcare.
Okay.
In America, it's really catered towards like pharmaceutical industry, and like they're the ones that kind of dictate prices. Like America is like ranked amongst like Western nations, like we're ranked pretty low in terms of quality healthcare. Yeah, we pay the highest premiums in the world, and kind of like I cater it towards like the idea of your freedom to like what is it, health and prosperity, whatever it is in the Declaration of Independence. Like this notion that like citizens, they're not given the proper healthcare they deserve. I see it as like a right.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that's deprived in America. I see that as unjust.
Okay, so if you think that healthcare is a right, you might think that we live in an unjust society because we're not providing that right. We're rationing it. We're rationing it via cost, if you understand properly, right? Like, with any scarce resource, there's always going to be rationing, and our system rations based on who can afford to pay it, and you might consider that to be the best form of rationing. But that's certainly an ethical consideration. Good. And what would you do to change the system?
I mean, lobbying and stuff.
Lobbying would be good. Lobby your representatives. What else? What other laws?